Consumer protection is at the heart of Idaho's agency laws. Sometimes it's hard to see the line between what is appropriate and what is illegal when it comes to agency duties. It is important both brokers and licensees understand the duties owed to their clients when they are participating in a limited dual agency transaction with potential complications. To help you navigate through limited dual agency, the following scenarios have been developed. In our first scenario, the agent, Jill, is working with buyers, Jennifer and Carl. Jill has a personal relationship with the buyers because she has worked with them on a previous transaction. After learning of Jennifer and Carl's needs, Jill realizes that there is an in-house listing that would meet their needs. She approaches her broker about how to handle the agency relationship as the sellers are brokerage clients and the buyers have not decided on a form of representation yet.
Hi, I want to run something by you. Are you available later today? Great. Okay. See you then. I think I've got a buyer for one of Tom's properties he mentioned in the office meeting this morning. I want to show his listing on 123 Elm to my former clients. They're pre-qualified and can easily afford it. I'm sure they'll be ready to write an offer if they like it. Now, even though Tom is already representing the seller, I can still represent the buyers, right?
Yes, you can represent them. I mean, we have a signed representation agreement with the seller, so we already have obligations to the seller. Client representation for the buyers will mean limited dual agency. The service you provide might need to change from what you've given them previously. Limited dual agency without assigned agents means that we can't take sides and have to treat both sides neutrally. So this means you can't advocate for your clients the way you did previously.
Okay. Well, at least they should be able to get a great deal, since the sellers are moving quickly because of the divorce. When do you think the price will drop from $320 to $310, like Tom mentioned in the meeting?
Well, Tom shouldn't have shared that information, and I'll be speaking to him about it later. But see, that's a perfect example of the type of information that must be kept confidential. I mean, any information you've already learned about the seller needs to be kept confidential, even if you're working with the buyer as an assigned agent.
Well, what about price? I know my buyers are going to rely on me to help them know how much to offer. So how can I help them without giving away what I know about the seller?
Well, you can provide comps for similar properties in the area and advise them on the fair market value of the property, but you can't use your knowledge that a price drop may occur to advise them. I mean, the only way you can tell them that the seller is highly motivated is if the seller agrees to let you tell your buyers.
That makes sense. What if I accidentally let something about the sellers slip to the buyers? I'll try not to, but I've worked with them on a lot of transactions and they're getting used to getting certain information from me about the properties they view. I'm worried I might let something slip.
Disclosing something that could harm either client's interests, even if it happens by accident, will create liability for the brokerage. If it happens, you need to tell me immediately. I'm required by law to send written notification to a client whose confidential information is disclosed, even if it's shared accidentally. But if you're careful, it shouldn't be a problem.
Know the agency options available for your brokerage. In agency, certain information must be kept confidential per Idaho Code 54-2088 4A. This information includes that the buyer is willing to pay more than the listing price, that the seller is willing to accept less than the listing price, the factors motivating the buyer and seller, that the buyer or seller will agree to price or financing terms other than those offered. If confidential information is disclosed under Idaho Code 54-2088 6, the broker is obligated to promptly provide written notice of the disclosure to the affected client. In this next scenario, The agent, Tom, is speaking with a buyer who fell in love with a property he saw at an open house the brokerage held recently.
Hey, Russell, this is Tom with JKL Realty. We met at my open house last weekend. I'd like to get your feedback on 456 Main and see if you got any questions.
I'm glad you called. I was going to call you today. I loved the house, especially how the owner extended the deck because it means less lawn to mow. I think I would like to make an offer on it. Can you help me with that?
My company is working with the seller, but we can also represent you if you'd like. There's several options for this. And before we get into any specifics, I need to ask if you already have a signed representation agreement with any other company. Have you been working with any other real estate agent?
No, I've been doing a lot of research online and going to open houses, but I haven't picked anyone to work with yet.
Great. I'd love to help you buy this house. Idaho allows several different options for representation, and I have a brochure the Idaho Real Estate Commission publishes outlining all the different options. I'll explain them to you now, and when we meet later, I'll give you a copy of the brochure to sign, just showing that I went over all the options with you. One of the options you have is to remain a customer of the brokerage. We can still work together, and I can give you information on the property, but I can't give you advice or negotiate for you, and I'm not bound to keep anything you tell me confidential. So, you should only share information you'd be comfortable telling the seller. I'd assist you with filling out the contract and other necessary acts throughout the transaction, and I would do so with honesty and care. Your earnest money would be properly accounted for, and I'd have to tell you about any adverse material facts.
What do you mean by adverse material facts?
Well, that means I'd have to let you know if I know something about the property that might deter you from buying it. Like if the house flooded a few years ago and the seller covered all the resulting mold with paint instead of properly treating it.
That makes sense. I would want to know if you found something out about the property that I didn't know.
Now, the second option is for my brokerage to represent both you and the seller as clients. In this case, we'd enter into limited dual agency without assigned agents. And the nice thing about this is that I can keep information you share with me confidential. That includes things like how much you're willing to pay if the seller rejects your initial offer and wants to counter at a higher price than you offered. So let's pretend a house is listed at $317,000. Let's say hypothetically that you offer $310,000. The seller wants to counter with $312,000, but I know you'd pay $322,000. I couldn't tell them you absolutely love the house and would pay more than asking price. Or tell you they have to be out of the state in 2 months and would take less just to close the deal. But I could tell you both that the neighborhood comps run about $316,000. So with option 2, our company can't favor one of you over the other because everyone in the company is working for both you and the seller equally. This gives you a higher level of service than working with us as a customer.
But negotiation is the part I really want to have my agent help me with. Is there any way you can represent me and root for me, even though you represent the seller too?
Yes, there is. The third option is for the brokerage to represent you and the seller using 2 different real estate agents. This is called limited dual agency with assigned agents. If you chose this option, I'd refer you to one of the other agents in our office that can do a great job for you, and I'd keep working with the seller. And if this happens, the agent working with you is able to promote your best interests, even if they conflict with the seller's best interest. I do the same for the seller. We will both maintain the confidentiality of our own respective clients.
I like the third option. What do we need to do next?
Would you like to meet at my office later? I can introduce you to an agent I think would work well for you. You can sign the agency disclosure brochure receipt and a representation agreement so the other agent can help you write up the offer.
Sure. I've got an appointment, but I think I can be there by 3.
Sounds great, Russell. See you then.
As you can see, the agent handled the delicate road of limited dual agency well. While some agents find it easy to balance working with both parties of the transaction, it doesn't hurt to check with your broker for guidance. Before beginning to work with a buyer or seller, it is essential the agent ask the individual if they are currently represented by another broker. Idaho Code 54-2054-4 strictly prohibits interference with the contractual relationship between a broker and a client. Explain the differences in agency representation so they understand how the agency relationship is limited in a limited dual agency transaction. In limited dual agency, the broker represents each client equally. If problems occur between the buyer and seller, the broker remains neutral and can help facilitate an agreement between the two parties. In our final scenario, we'll explore how limited dual agency with and without assigned agents is handled in a brokerage setting. Although teams are depicted in this scenario, the same responsibilities and risk reduction techniques apply to brokerages, branch offices, teams, groups, and other organizational structures. In this scenario, our broker is counseling with agents Jill and Tom, who each run a team within the brokerage.
Jill, Tom, I've asked you to meet with me today to discuss some issues I see with your teams when it comes to limited dual agency.
Our team specializes in working with buyers, so this isn't a problem for us. When we're contacted by a seller, we just refer them to another team.
Well, actually, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The agency contract is between a buyer, seller, and the brokerage, not a buyer or seller and a particular agent or team. So anytime the buyer and seller are both represented by the brokerage, even if it's on different teams, the relationship is a limited dual agency relationship.
Oh, that's why my contracts keep getting sent back to me corrected.
Yes, and that's why I've brought a few contracts here as examples. Now, on this first contract, Jill, option A has been selected for both the buyer and the seller in the representation confirmation section. However, Tom's team is working with the seller and your team is working with the buyer.
But isn't that correct? My team is working with the buyer as a client, so we select option A. And since the seller's rep is from Tom's team and is working exclusively with the seller, that would also be option A, right?
No. The only time option A would be selected for both parties is when the brokerage is working with either the buyer or the seller as a client, and another brokerage is working with the other party. If the brokerage is working with one party as a customer and the other as a client, then option D would be selected for the customer and option A for the client. Now, if our brokerage is working with both the buyer and the seller as clients, then option B or C would be the correct selection, depending on whether agents have been assigned.
I guess we hadn't been looking at it that way. I'll make sure to set my team right on that.
Great. Now, in this second contract, it looks like option B has been selected for the buyer and option C for the seller. That means one side is working with an assigned agent and the other isn't. Now, can either of you tell me why that would not be correct?
Well, wouldn't both the buyer and seller either be working with assigned agents or neither one? It seems like, from what you said before, it can't be mixed.
That's right. In this case, a member of Jill's team was working with the buyer as an assigned agent, and a member of your team was working with the seller as an assigned agent. That means the correct option for both buyer and seller should have been C.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this now. If I was personally double-ending a deal, then I'd select B and B because I'm working for both the buyer and the seller without any assigned agents.
Yes. I think you see what the problem is now. Now, if you ever need help with which option to select on the representation confirmation section, please let me know. Another concern that I have is that I've heard your teams have been holding regular meetings where listings plus sellers and buyers' needs are discussed. Now, the danger here is that team members may learn confidential information about in-house listings or buyers' resources. Because these are conversations about our clients of the brokerage, the information being shared needs to stay confidential. Although I know no one would ever divulge anything intentionally, if it does happen, it becomes an issue that must be reported to the client. It creates a liability not only for me, but for the brokerage.
But my team really loves those meetings. It helps everyone get pumped up and helps us identify properties that we can bring buyers to. We rely on each other's help to get our clients the best deal we can.
Well, I mean, of course you can still work together and hold regular meetings, but it is important that discussions stick to the facts about the property and information that isn't confidential. The buyer or seller motivation, willingness to consider offers or other terms and conditions, and the price either side is willing to accept needs to be left out of the discussion. In fact, any discussion regarding price adjustments are just better left out altogether.
We can do that. Thanks for the advice. Are there other things we should be doing differently?
Well, another thing agents sometimes struggle with is when they work with a buyer who has previously been represented by the brokerage as a seller client. It's natural they'd expect the same level of service and information as before. However, if they become interested in a listing of ours, we get into a limited dual agency situation. And as such, you won't be able to provide them with the same level of guidance as when they were the only client of the brokerage in a transaction. I mean, it's really important that we don't overpromise on our services in a way that could compromise our service during a transaction with limited dual agency. We're also required to keep information learned previously about a client confidential, even if they come to us as a customer later on.
So we aren't helping our clients the way we should be then. I mean, we promise them they can expect the highest level of service when working with our team.
No, we're just helping them in a different way. This will take some practice, but the key is to always keep your client duties in mind. Now, I know we don't usually memorize these things, but I've taken the time to mark that section there in our law book. So whenever you get a chance, please, familiarize yourselves with it a little bit better. You're still required to perform the terms of your written agreement with your client, to exercise reasonable skill and care, to be honest, to receive and present all written offers and counteroffers, to account for any property and money received, and to assist them in locating a suitable property.
How would we even be able to negotiate in that situation?
Well, that's one of the ways your assistance to them is limited. When limited dual agency without assigned agents is in play, you can no longer advocate for one client over another. You must act in a way that doesn't create any conflict of interest for the brokerage.
We often have first-time home buyers, most of whom don't know anything about the market, and they're depending on us to really lead them through the transaction as their agent. They think my job as their agent is to get them the best deal.
Yeah, well, we need to remind them of our duties as a dual agent, focusing on what we can do for them, and as appropriate, reminding them we can't share information that may be detrimental to the other party. Now, in any transaction, we should be careful preparing and providing the information to ensure we're allowing the client to make an informed decision.
All right, what about using assigned agents? Doesn't that allow us to advocate for the client as if they were our only client in the transaction?
Well, assigned agency does allow you to represent the client more fully. Now, in this situation, you'd be able to advocate for the client, but there are still some limits on the information you can provide. Sometimes agents mistakenly believe that if they're representing a buyer in a transaction, they're obligated to disclose any information they learn about the seller that'll help the buyer. That's one reason why those team or office meetings should focus on the details of the property and shouldn't include any discussions of client motivation.
Since our team only represents buyers, I never realized if my team represents the buyer and another team in the office represents the seller, we're still assigned agents?
Yes. And it does require the assigned agents set up safeguards to ensure the confidentiality of client information. But it isn't substantially more than the safeguards that should be in place for every client.
While I was having dinner last week, I overheard a couple of real estate agents talking about their clients at another table, and it made me so uncomfortable to know they didn't realize I could hear them and what they were saying. Confidentiality is something we always have to keep in mind because we never know who might be listening.
I agree. Things like keeping client folders locked up instead of strewn out on a desk, or picking documents off the printer promptly.
Avoiding shared email addresses and only discussing confidential information in a secure environment.
Very important.
Really important.
Confidentiality and managing client expectations are the most important aspects of agency in any transaction. but especially when limited dual agency is involved. Now, as your broker, I'm the number one source of guidance in this topic. Even though each of you has established a team, I'm still responsible for supervising all licensed and unlicensed staff associated with my brokerage. That means I can be held accountable for actions of your team members. Liability is a broker's kryptonite. As members of the brokerage, we all have a responsibility to put safeguards in place to reduce our liability.
Even though the buyer or seller may not be represented by your team, they may still be represented by another agent within the brokerage. The agency relationship is between the client and the broker, not the agent and the client. If the agency relationship is limited dual agency without assigned agents, all associates of the firm must refrain from advocating on behalf of one client over another. They must also refrain from disclosing information they obtained from any other client with whom the brokerage has or had an agency relationship. Confidential information must be carefully safeguarded. Limited dual agency representation can require more care and thought, but it doesn't have to be difficult. Take the time now to have a discussion with your broker about how to handle certain situations when they occur.